March 23, 1943. 0847 hours. Bay of Biscay, 47 degrees north 6 degrees west. Captain Lieutenant Werner Hochstein peered through the spray-drenched periscope of U-437, watching the distant silhouette of a Bristol Beaufighter circling lazily at 2,000 feet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The 31-year-old veteran smirked beneath his salt-crusted beard, his voice crackling through the cramped conning tower intercom. They're sending flying buses to hunt us now. Look at that fat English pig circling like a lost seagull. His crew chuckled nervously, condensation dripping from the steel walls around them. What Hochstein didn't know, what none of the 863 U-boat captains operating in the Atlantic could have imagined, was that he was staring at the weapon that would transform submarine warfare from a hunter's game into a nightmare of terror. Within 18 months, the mere sound of those twin Bristol Hercules engines would send experienced commanders into panic dives, their hands shaking on the dive klaxon. The mathematics of death were already loaded in that aircraft's belly, a Mollins 57mm automatic cannon, firing 6-pound shells at 95 rounds per minute, with enough penetrating power to punch through a submarine's pressure hull like it was made of tin foil. From the moment a Beaufighter's pilot acquired visual contact to the moment those shells tore through steel and flesh, German captains had exactly 18 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether their crew lived or died. The Battle of the Atlantic in early 1943 represented Germany's closest approach to victory in World War II. Admiral Dönitz's U-boat fleet, operating in coordinated wolf packs, was systematically strangling Britain's maritime lifeline. The statistics were devastating. In March 1943 alone, German submarines sank 108 Allied merchant ships totaling 627,377 tons, more than could be replaced by all Allied shipyards combined. Corvettenkapitän Heinrich Bleichrodt, commanding U-109 from his headquarters in Lorient, France, had perfected the art of convoy destruction. His tactical doctrine, adopted across the U-boat service, emphasized surface attacks at night when submarines could use their diesel engines for speed and maneuverability. Submerged, U-boats were slow, nearly blind, and vulnerable. On the surface, they were fast attack craft capable of 17 knots, armed with deck guns and torpedo tubes. The Type WWII U-boat, the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine, displaced 769 tons surfaced and could dive to 230 meters. Its crew of 44 men operated in conditions that tested human endurance: no privacy, minimal sanitation, constant humidity that rusted everything metal and rotted anything organic, air so foul that matches wouldn't light after 2 weeks submerged. Yet these steel coffins were winning the war. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Oberleutnant zur See Gustav Keller, watch officer aboard U-523, wrote in his diary on February 14, 1943, sank 2 freighters last night, 14,000 tons combined. The British are helpless. Their escorts are too few, too slow. We surface after dark, attack at will, dive before dawn. The Tommies call us the Grey Wolves. We call ourselves unbeatable. Nothing they have can stop us when we're properly handled. The British Admiralty knew Keller was right. Despite deploying thousands of escort vessels, installing radar on ships and aircraft, and breaking German naval codes, U-boats were sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. The crisis was existential. If the Atlantic supply line collapsed, Britain would starve and the planned invasion of Europe would become impossible. Coastal Command, the RAF organization responsible for maritime patrol, faced a frustrating reality. Their aircraft could locate submarines on the surface using ASV, air-to-surface vessel, radar, but when they arrived, U-boats simply dived. The standard attack, dropping depth charges in the swirl where a submarine had submerged, was largely ineffective. U-boats could dive to 100 feet in 35 seconds, deep enough that depth charges set for shallow detonation passed harmlessly overhead. Air Marshal Sir John Slessor, commanding Coastal Command, summarized the problem in a January 1943 staff meeting. We can find them, but we cannot kill them quickly enough. By the time our aircraft arrive overhead, the submarine is gone. We need a weapon that can destroy a U-boat in the seconds before it submerges, not the minutes after. The Bristol Beaufighter had entered service in 1940 as a night fighter and ground attack aircraft, never intended for anti-submarine warfare. Twin Bristol Hercules radial engines producing 1,670 horsepower each gave it a top speed of 330 miles per hour and a range exceeding 1,500 miles, ideal for long maritime patrols over the Atlantic and Bay of Biscay. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, a test pilot at the RAF's Experimental Flying Unit, first proposed mounting heavy cannon in Beaufighters for anti-shipping strikes in mid-1942. The standard armament, 420mm Hispano cannon in the nose and 6.303 machine guns in the wings, proved inadequate against reinforced concrete U-boat pens and the increasingly armored merchant vessels the Germans were using. What Beaumont and his engineering team proposed was radical, mounting a fully automatic 57mm naval gun in the aircraft's belly, along with 420mm cannon and rockets. The Mollins gun, originally designed for Royal Navy motor torpedo boats, fired a 6-pound armor-piercing shell capable of penetrating 3 inches of steel plate at 1,000 yards. The engineering challenges were immense. The Mollins gun weighed 1,200 pounds and generated recoil forces that could tear an aircraft apart if not properly mounted. The automatic loading mechanism added another 800 pounds. Ammunition for a typical combat load, 25 rounds, weighed an additional 400 pounds. The entire installation required reinforcing the Beaufighter's fuselage structure and redesigning the aircraft's center of gravity calculations. Squadron leader Geoffrey Whitehead, commanding 254 Squadron at RAF North Coats, received the first operational Beaufighter strike fighters in November 1942. His initial reaction, recorded in the squadron diary, was skeptical. The aircraft handles like a pregnant elephant with this cannon installation. Rate of climb is abysmal, maneuverability is compromised, and the recoil when firing makes accurate aiming nearly impossible. I fail to see how this contraption will improve our effectiveness against U-boats. The first combat trials in December 1942 seemed to confirm Whitehead's pessimism. Flying Officer Marcus Ashton led a flight of 4 Beaufighters against a surfaced U-boat in the Bay of Biscay on December 8. The submarine, later identified as U-254 under Captain Lieutenant Hans Gillardone, spotted the approaching aircraft at 6 miles distance, plenty of time to execute a crash dive. Ashton's combat report detailed the failure, engaged target at 0923 hours. Enemy submarine crash dived as we approached. Fired entire 57mm ammunition load at the swirl. No effect observed. Submarine escaped. The cannon installation is impressive in theory but useless if the target disappears before we can engage. What neither Whitehead nor Ashton understood yet was that they were using the weapon incorrectly. The Mollins cannon wasn't meant to sink submarines after they dived, it was designed to destroy them before they could dive at all. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Flight Lieutenant Dennis Watkins, a former commercial fisherman from Cornwall who had joined the RAF in 1940. Watkins, flying with 248 Squadron, understood something about submarine behavior that the career military officers missed. On January 19, 1943, Watkins was on patrol over the Bay of Biscay when his navigator, Sergeant Thomas Caldwell, detected a radar contact at 12 miles. As they closed on the target, Watkins descended to wavetop height, using the radar returns from the sea surface to mask his approach. U-boat lookouts, scanning the horizon and sky, were trained to watch for aircraft silhouettes against the clouds or stars. They weren't prepared for an aircraft approaching at 50 feet, its dark camouflage blending with the gray Atlantic waters. Watkins closed to within 2 miles before the submarine's bridge watch spotted his Beaufighter. Captain Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann, commanding U-621, later described the moment in his POW interrogation. The aircraft appeared from nowhere, already so close that we could see the pilot's face. I ordered crash dive immediately, but before the lookouts could even clear the bridge, the British opened fire. Not with bombs or depth charges, with cannon fire that sounded like 1,000 hammers striking steel. Watkins had opened fire at 1,200 yards, the Molin's cannon sending 57mm shells screaming across the water at 2,800 feet per second. Each shell weighed 6 pounds and carried enough kinetic energy to penetrate armor plate designed to withstand depth charge explosions. The effect was catastrophic. The first shell struck U-621's conning tower, penetrating clean through and exploding inside, killing 3 lookouts instantly. The second shell hit the forward deck, punching through the pressure hull and flooding the forward torpedo room. The third and fourth shells struck the main pressure hull amidships, creating holes 18 inches in diameter that seawater poured through at thousands of gallons per minute. Hoffman's U-boat never completed its dive. The pressure hull, breached in 3 locations, couldn't maintain integrity. As seawater flooded the forward and central compartments, U-621 took on a bow-down angle and plunged toward the bottom. Hoffman managed to blow ballast tanks and surface the dying submarine, ordering abandon ship as his boat settled into the water. Watkins circled overhead as the German crew took to their life rafts. His camera recorded the entire sequence, the initial strikes, the submarine's abortive dive, its emergency surfacing, and its final sinking 12 minutes after the first shell hit. When he landed back at North Coast 3 hours later, the film was immediately couriered to Coastal Command headquarters. Air Vice Marshal Brian Baker, watching the gun camera footage the next morning, immediately grasped the implications. "This changes everything. We've been trying to sink submarines after they dive. This weapon can destroy them before they can dive. If we can close undetected and open fire at the right moment, we can kill U-boats faster than they can react." Detailed analysis of combat film and technical trials established the critical timeline that would define Beaufighter anti-submarine tactics. The sequence was brutally simple and absolutely unforgiving. 0 seconds, U-boat lookouts spot approaching Beaufighter. 2 to 4 seconds, lookouts shout warning, captain orders crash dive, dive klaxon sounds. 4 to 8 seconds, bridge watch scrambles down conning tower hatch, bridge hatch closes. 8 to 12 seconds, diesel engine shut down, electric motors engage, hydroplane set to maximum dive angle. 12 to 18 seconds, submarine begins forward motion with down angle, starts submerging. 18 to 25 seconds, conning tower submerges, only periscope standards visible. 25 to 35 seconds, submarine completely submerged at approximately 30 to 50 feet depth. The Beaufighter strike, approaching at 280 miles per hour, covered 400 feet per second. From 2 miles out, the typical distance at which alert lookouts spotted an approaching aircraft, pilots had approximately 25 seconds before the submarine's conning tower went under. But the Molin's gun required 7 seconds to aim, stabilize, and fire its first burst. This meant pilots needed to open fire no later than 18 seconds after being spotted, exactly the moment when the submarine's pressure hull was most vulnerable, still on the surface but with hatches closed and crew unable to man defensive weapons. Flight Lieutenant Robert Hargrove, working with Coastal Command's Operational Research Section, calculated the optimal attack profile, approach at 50 to 100 feet altitude to minimize visual acquisition time. Open fire at 800 to 1,200 yards range. The first burst should strike the conning tower and forward pressure hull. Continue firing while closing to 400 yards, then pull up to avoid your own shell fragments. Total engagement time, 6 to 8 seconds. Rounds expended, 15 to 20. Result, catastrophic damage to pressure hull before submarine can reach safe depth. The tactics were refined at the Coastal Command Development Unit at RAF Thorney Island, where captured U-boat sections were used as targets. Squadron leader James Morrison, leading the tactical development program, discovered that 57mm armor-piercing shells could penetrate a Type 7 U-boat's 26mm pressure hull at any angle up to 60 degrees off perpendicular. The submarine's armor is designed to withstand external water pressure and proximity explosions from depth charges, Morrison explained in his March 1943 training manual. It was never designed to stop armor-piercing projectiles traveling at 2,800 feet per second. A single hit on the main pressure hull creates a hole that cannot be sealed and makes diving impossible. Multiple hits doom the boat absolutely. News of Watkins' success spread rapidly through Coastal Command. By February 1943, 6 squadrons had received Beaufighter strikes: 143, 236, 248, 254, 404, RCAF, and 455, RAAF, squadrons. Pilots practiced the new low-level approach tactics, learning to use radar to track targets while remaining invisible below the horizon. The Germans, monitoring increased Beaufighter activity in the Bay of Biscay, initially dismissed the threat. Corvettenkapitän Peter Kramer, one of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders, wrote in his patrol report from U-333's February transit, sighted several enemy aircraft during Bay transit. All were easily evaded by crash diving. The British have achieved nothing despite their radar. We submerge before they can attack. This crossing was completely uneventful. Kramer's confidence was shared throughout the U-boat service. The standard procedure, crash dive when aircraft appeared, had worked for 3 years. There was no reason to believe it wouldn't continue working. On February 27, 1943, that confidence began to crack. U-558, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Gunther Kreck, was transiting the Bay of Biscay on the surface in bright afternoon sunlight. Kreck, a careful commander with 2 years of combat experience, maintained 3 lookouts on the bridge continuously scanning for aircraft. At 1,447 hours, the starboard lookout screamed a warning: aircraft, starboard beam, 2,000 meters, closing fast. Kreck saw the Beaufighter simultaneously, a dark shape racing toward them barely above the wave tops, already far too close. Alarm! Kreck shouted, slamming his hand on the dive klaxon. The harsh klaxon rang through U-558's hull as the lookouts scrambled for the conning tower hatch. Kreck dropped through last, yanking the hatch shut and dogging it closed. Below, the engineering watch was already shutting down the diesels and engaging electric motors. What Kreck didn't know was that squadron leader Julian Morrison of 248 Squadron had been tracking U-558 on radar for 15 minutes, using the radar returns from the ocean surface to mask his approach. Morrison had descended to 75 feet and closed to within 3 miles before being visually spotted. Morrison's navigator, Flying Officer Charles Bennett, counted down the range: 1,000 yards, 800, opening fire now. The Molin's cannon erupted, its distinctive hammering roar audible above the Bristol Hercules engines. Morrison's first burst, 5 rounds in 3 seconds, walked up the U-boat's hull from stern to bow. The first shell missed, throwing up a geyser of white water 20 feet short. The second struck U-558's afterdeck, punching through the wooden deck planking and ricocheting off the internal pressure hull. The third shell hit the base of the conning tower, penetrating the pressure hull just below the waterline and exploding inside the radio room. The fourth and fifth shells struck forward of the conning tower, both penetrating the pressure hull amidships in the control room area. 6-pound armor-piercing projectiles traveling at 2,800 feet per second created 18-inch diameter holes surrounded by pedaled steel fragments driven inward by the shell's impact. Inside U-558, pandemonium erupted. The control room, where Chief Engineer Oberleutnant Klaus Friedman was supervising the crash dive, was suddenly filled with seawater jets powerful enough to knock men off their feet. Friedman stared in horror as 3 high-pressure streams, each capable of filling a room in seconds, poured through holes torn in the pressure hull. "Seal those breaches!" Friedman screamed, but there was no way to seal holes that large with water pressure driving the flow. The damage control team tried jamming mattresses and wooden planks into the holes, but the pressure simply blew the patches away. Kreck, still in the conning tower, felt the submarine taking on a steep bow-down angle as thousands of gallons flooded the forward compartments. He knew immediately that U-558 was finished. Surface. Blow all ballast tanks. All hands prepare to abandon ship. U-558 broke surface one final time, water pouring from the holes in her hull. Morrison circled overhead as the German crew scrambled onto the deck and jumped into the Atlantic. He photographed the sinking but didn't fire again. The submarine was clearly doomed. U-558 slipped beneath the waves 7 minutes after taking the first hits. 44 men survived, 3 were killed by the shell that penetrated the radio room. News of U-558's destruction reached U-boat headquarters in WWII within 24 hours. Admiral Dönitz, commanding the U-boat service, initially dismissed the report as an anomaly. Aircraft had occasionally damaged submarines before, this was nothing new. What Dönitz didn't realize was that Morrison's attack represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power. By March 15, 1943, 3 more U-boats had been destroyed by Beaufighter strikes using identical tactics. U-665 under Oberleutnant Hans-Jürgen Haupt was caught on the surface southeast of Cape Finisterre by Flight Lieutenant David Thornton of 236 Squadron. Thornton's first burst struck the pressure hull in 3 places. U-665 sank in 4 minutes with all hands lost. U-384, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hans-Joachim von Rosenberg-Gruszczynski, survived the initial attack by Flying Officer Stuart McLeod of 404 Squadron RCAF but took 2 57mm hits that flooded the engine room. Von Rosenberg managed to keep the boat on the surface and limp toward the French coast, but a second Beaufighter, piloted by Squadron Leader Anthony Gadd of 143 Squadron, found the crippled submarine 8 hours later and finished it off with rockets and cannon fire. U-445, under Captain Lieutenant Wilhelm Korner, was destroyed on March 19 by Flight Lieutenant Raymond Blackwell of 248 Squadron. Blackwell's attack was textbook perfect: approach at wave-top height, open fire at 900 yards, 6 shells in 8 seconds. U-445's pressure hull was breached in 5 locations. The submarine went down so fast that only 11 crew members escaped. Corvette Captain Ernst Cowles, a highly experienced commander recently promoted to staff duties in WWII, analyzed the attack reports with growing alarm. What disturbed him most wasn't the losses themselves. U-boats had always faced danger, but the complete ineffectiveness of the standard defense. Cowles' report to Dönitz, dated March 22, 1943, was blunt: the British have developed a tactic that makes our surface operations in the Bay of Biscay potentially suicidal. Their aircraft approach below visual acquisition distance, using radar to track us while remaining invisible. By the time lookouts spot them, they're already within cannon range. The crash dive, our primary defense for 3 years, is now useless. These aircraft fire weapons that penetrate our pressure hull before we can submerge. We are being destroyed on the surface with no effective countermeasure. Dönitz, who had built his entire strategic concept around the U-boat's ability to dive and evade, refused to accept that the fundamental equation had changed. His response ordered increased vigilance, maintain additional lookouts. Dive earlier. Transit the bay at night. These measures will restore our security. But it was already too late. The Beaufighter squadrons had found the killing method, and they were hunting with increasing efficiency. By April 1943, U-Boat Command implemented a series of defensive modifications. The most visible was the addition of anti-aircraft armament. U-boats began sailing with quadruple 20mm flak-Vierling mounts on reinforced platforms behind the conning tower, along with single 37mm guns and additional machine guns. Captain Lieutenant Siegfried Koitschke, commanding U-616, was one of the first to test the new doctrine. On April 7, his orders were explicit: if attacked by aircraft, remain on surface and fight. Do not dive. Use concentrated anti-aircraft fire to destroy or drive off attackers. When Flight Lieutenant Herbert Maxwell of 455 Squadron RAAF appeared over the horizon at 1,523 hours, Koitschke did exactly as ordered. Instead of diving, he ordered battle stations surface and his flak crews open fire at maximum range, nearly 3,000 yards. Maxwell, expecting the standard crash dive, was surprised to see tracer fire arcing toward his Beaufighter. He jinked hard left, feeling 20mm shells crack past his cockpit. His navigator, Flight Sergeant Colin Armstrong, shouted, "They're not diving. They're fighting." Maxwell pulled up to 500 feet, circling to assess the situation. U-616's flak crews were maintaining intense fire, creating a visible wall of tracers between the aircraft and submarine. Maxwell tried 2 attack runs, but each time the concentrated fire forced him to break off before reaching cannon range. After 10 minutes of circling, Maxwell's fuel state forced him to break contact. U-616 remained on the surface, its flak crews celebrating their apparent victory. Koichka transmitted a jubilant report: engaged enemy Beaufighter. Drove off attacker with anti-aircraft fire. New tactics are effective. Remaining surfaced as viable defense. The celebration was premature. What Koichka didn't know was that Maxwell had transmitted his position and situation before departing. Squadron leader Vincent O'Brien, leading a flight of 3 Beaufighters from 143 Squadron, was vectored to the contact. O'Brien's approach was different. Instead of a single aircraft attacking from one direction, his 3 Beaufighters spread into a wide formation and attacked simultaneously from 3 different angles. U-616's flak crews could only concentrate on one attacker at a time. Flying Officer Richard Patterson attacked from the port beam while Flight Lieutenant Norman Clark came in from starboard. O'Brien himself approached from dead ahead, the smallest target profile but also the most dangerous, as every gun on the U-boat could bear forward. Patterson opened fire first at 1,000 yards. His 57mm shells smashed into U-616's flak platform, killing 3 gunners instantly and destroying the quadruple 20mm mount in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Clark's burst struck the conning tower and forward pressure hull, 2 shells penetrating below the waterline. O'Brien's attack was the coup de grace. Firing from directly ahead, his shells walked straight down U-616's centerline. 3 hits on the forward pressure hull, 1 shell entering through the forward torpedo loading hatch, another smashing through the conning tower base. Koichka, wounded in the shoulder by shell fragments, realized his submarine was finished. The pressure hull was breached in at least 6 locations, water pouring into the forward torpedo room and control room faster than pumps could handle. He ordered abandon ship as U-616 settled by the bow. The 3 Beaufighters circled overhead as the German crew took to their life rafts. Koichka was among the survivors, pulled from the water by a British destroyer 8 hours later. In his POW interrogation, he was asked about the decision to fight on the surface. It was suicide, Koichka admitted, his wounded shoulder bandaged. 1 aircraft we might drive off. But 3? Impossible. They coordinated perfectly. While our guns engaged one, the others killed us. The shells went through our armor like it was paper. Men were torn apart by the explosions. I saw our pressure hull punctured in 6 places. No submarine can survive that. Despite the failure of surface fighting, some U-boat captains developed a cunning counter-tactic. If Beaufighters expected submarines to dive, what if instead they used the submarine as bait to lure aircraft into an ambush? Korvettenkapitän Wolfgang Luth, one of Germany's most successful and innovative commanders, proposed the concept in a May 1943 tactical paper. U-boats would transit in pairs, one would sail visibly on the surface while a Junkers Ju-88 long-range fighter orbited at high altitude, invisible to radar and waiting for Beaufighters to appear. The first attempt occurred on May 14, 1943. U-468 under Captain Lieutenant Clemens Scamong sailed on the surface in the Bay of Biscay while 2 Ju-88 C-6 fighters from V/KG-40, piloted by Oberleutnant Herbert Henze and Lieutenant Franz Kieslich, circled at 15,000 feet. At 1,048 hours, Flying Officer Albert Richardson of 248 Squadron detected U-468 on radar and began his approach. Richardson, an experienced pilot with 3 U-boat kills to his credit, followed standard procedure: descend to wavetop height, close to within 3 miles before visual acquisition, prepare to fire at 800 yards. What Richardson didn't know was that Henze's Ju-88, equipped with Liechtenstein radar, had detected his Beaufighter at 20 miles range and was already diving to intercept. Richardson's navigator, Sergeant William Foster, was counting down the range to U-468, 3 miles, 2.5, Target should be visual any moment, when Foster suddenly screamed, "Break right!" Fighter attacking. The Ju-88's first burst of 20mm cannon fire tore through the Beaufighter's port wing, destroying the aileron and puncturing the fuel tank. Richardson threw his aircraft into a violent right turn, but the Ju-88, more maneuverable than the heavy Beaufighter, stayed glued to his tail. Hincey's second burst struck the Beaufighter's fuselage, killing Foster instantly and severing control cables. Richardson fought the dying aircraft, trying to gain enough altitude to allow his crew to bail out, but the Beaufighter was already on fire. At 400 feet altitude, with flames engulfing the cockpit, Richardson ordered his two gunners to jump. Both parachutes opened successfully. Richardson attempted to follow but couldn't free himself from his straps as the burning aircraft plunged toward the sea. The Beaufighter hit the water at over 200 miles per hour, killing Richardson on impact. The ambush appeared successful. U-468 continued its patrol, and Hincey claimed one Beaufighter destroyed. But the Germans had overlooked a critical factor. Coastal Command now operated in coordinated groups, with multiple aircraft covering the same patrol area. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Mackenzie of 404 Squadron RCAF, patrolling 40 miles south of Richardson's position, received the distress call and immediately altered course toward the last reported position. Mackenzie's navigator, Flying Officer James Dunlop, detected U-468 on radar and simultaneously picked up the Ju-88 at 8,000 feet, circling the area. Mackenzie, a former bush pilot from Saskatchewan with nerves of steel, decided to ignore the fighter and attack the submarine immediately. If we go after the fighter, the sub dives and escapes. If we go after the sub, maybe we kill it before the fighter kills us. I'll take that trade. Mackenzie dove toward the sea surface, accelerating to maximum speed, 340 miles per hour indicated. The Ju-88, occupied with ensuring Richardson's Beaufighter was destroyed, didn't spot Mackenzie until he was less than 2 miles from U-468. Scammon, watching from U-468's bridge, saw the second Beaufighter racing toward him and immediately ordered crash dive. But Mackenzie had closed too quickly. As the lookouts scrambled below and Scammon slammed the conning tower hatch, Mackenzie's Molin's cannon opened fire at 950 yards. The range was longer than optimal, but Mackenzie was an exceptional marksman. His first shell struck U-468's afterdeck. The second hit the base of the conning tower. The third and fourth shells, fired as the submarine's bow dipped beneath the surface, struck the pressure hull amidships just as the submarine began its dive angle. One shell penetrated the pressure hull in the engine room, the other breached the hull in the galley area. Both holes were below the waterline and catastrophically positioned for a diving submarine. As U-468's bow dipped and the stern rose, water pressure forced massive flows through both breaches. Chief Engineer Oberleutnant Karl Freitag, supervising the dive from the control room, heard the distinctive sound of high-pressure water entry and knew immediately what had happened. Pressure hull breached. Flooding in engine room and amidships. Scammon, in the conning tower, made the instantaneous calculation that every U-boat commander dreaded. If he continued diving, the increasing water pressure would enlarge the breaches and accelerate flooding, the submarine would sink uncontrollably. If he surfaced, the Beaufighter would finish them off. Either choice meant death. He chose the chance of survival. Surface. Blow everything. Abandon ship. U-468 broke surface one final time, water cascading from the holes in her hull. The Ju-88, finally recognizing the second Beaufighter, dove to attack, but Mackenzie had already pulled up to 1,000 feet and was racing for cloud cover. Hincey pursued but couldn't close the distance before Mackenzie disappeared into a rain squall. Scammon and 38 of his crew survived. 6 men were trapped in the flooded compartments and drowned as U-468 sank. The junker trap had killed one Beaufighter but cost one U-boat, an unacceptable exchange rate for Germany's dwindling submarine fleet. By June 1943, the psychological impact of Beaufighter attacks was becoming apparent throughout the U-boat service. Experienced commanders who had survived multiple patrols began showing signs of what would later be recognized as combat stress disorder. Captain Lieutenant Johann Moore, a decorated veteran with 29 ships sunk, wrote in his diary during U-124's final patrol, "The bay crossing has become a nightmare. Every man is on edge. The lookouts stare at the horizon until their eyes water, terrified of missing the first glimpse of a Beaufighter. We know that if one appears close, we have perhaps 15 seconds before those terrible guns tear us apart. 15 seconds to spot the aircraft, sound the alarm, get the bridge watch below, close the hatch, and pray the shells don't find us before we're deep enough. It's impossible. We're sailing to our deaths." Moore's premonition proved accurate. On June 2, 1943, Squadron Leader Philip Durand of 143 Squadron caught U-124 on the surface at dawn. Moore's lookouts spotted the Beaufighter at 2 miles, adequate distance under previous conditions, but now hopelessly inadequate. Durand opened fire at 850 yards while U-124 was still on the surface with its conning tower hatch open. The first 57mm shell entered through the open hatch and exploded inside the conning tower, killing Moore and his watch officer instantly. The second shell penetrated the pressure hull forward of the conning tower. The third hit aft, near the engine room. U-124 sank in less than 3 minutes. Only 2 survivors were pulled from the water. The death of Moore, a skilled and cautious commander, sent shockwaves through the U-boat service. If someone of his experience and ability couldn't survive, who could? Oberleutnant Peter Ottmar, commanding U-732, experienced a complete nervous breakdown after a near-miss encounter on June 18. Flight Lieutenant Douglas Bannerman of 455 Squadron attacked U-732 as it was crash diving, firing at the swirl. 1 shell struck the submarine's stern as it submerged, causing significant damage but not fatal flooding. Ottmar managed to level off at 200 feet and limp back to Brest, but the experience shattered him. His engineering officer, Lieutenant Hans Kohler, later reported, "The captain was never the same after that attack. He refused to surface during daylight. When we had to surface at night for battery charging, he kept the crew at dive stations and maintained only one lookout, himself. He would scan the sky continuously, spinning in circles, muttering about the guns. After 4 hours on watch, he collapsed from exhaustion. He was medically evacuated when we reached port." The German medical service began reporting an epidemic of what they termed Biscay sickness, acute anxiety, insomnia, tremors, and psychological breakdown among U-boat crews. Some men refused to sail. Others deserted. The elite U-boat service, which had once attracted volunteers eager for combat and glory, now struggled to find crews willing to risk the bay crossing. The numbers told a story of systematic destruction. In the 3 months from April through June 1943, Beaufighter strikes sank or severely damaged 27 U-boats, more than depth charges, torpedoes, and conventional aircraft attacks combined during the same period. 254 Squadron alone, commanded by Wing Commander Lawrence Petley, destroyed 9 U-boats between May and August 1943. The squadron's tactics were refined to perfection, pairs of Beaufighters patrolling overlapping sectors, constant radio communication, immediate reinforcement of any contact. German submarines transiting the bay faced a gauntlet where detection meant death. Squadron leader Samuel Davidson of 248 Squadron became one of the war's most successful anti-submarine pilots, personally destroying 6 U-boats between March and September 1943. His technique was clinical: approach at exactly 75 feet altitude, open fire at 850 yards, 6-round burst aimed at the junction between conning tower and pressure hull, pull up at 400 yards. His gun camera film showed the same result every time: pressure hull punctured, catastrophic flooding, submarine sinking or surfacing to abandon ship. The industrial response to the Beaufighter's success was characteristically British: produce more of them, faster. Bristol's Filton factory, which had built 140 Beaufighters in 1942, produced 780 in 1943. Production lines in Australia added another 365 aircraft. By late 1943, Coastal Command operated over 300 Beaufighter strikes, enough to maintain constant patrols over every U-boat transit route. Each Beaufighter required 18,000 man-hours to build, 15,000 individual parts, 3 miles of electrical wiring, and 2,500 pounds of aluminum alloy. The Molin's cannon installation alone took 80 man-hours to install and calibrate. Yet British factories produced them with assembly line efficiency that would have impressed Henry Ford. The ammunition production was equally impressive. Each 57mm shell required precise machining of the steel case, careful loading of explosives, and installation of the armor-piercing penetrator core. The Birmingham Small Arms Factory produced 80,000 rounds monthly by mid-1943, enough to keep every Beaufighter's magazines full. Most critically, pilot training maintained quality despite increased quantity. New Beaufighter pilots received 60 hours of type training, including 20 hours of low-level navigation over water, 15 hours of simulated attacks against towed targets, and gun camera evaluation of every practice attack. They studied combat film from successful attacks, learning the precise timing and angles that maximized hit probability. Flight Lieutenant Roger Mills, arriving at 236 Squadron in July 1943, described his training. By the time I flew my first operational patrol, I had practiced the attack sequence 90 times. I knew exactly what the submarine would look like at 1,000 yards, 800 yards, 600 yards. I knew the sight picture when the shells would hit. I knew the sound of the cannon firing, the recoil shaking the aircraft. When I encountered my first real U-boat, it was just like training. The submarine never had a chance. By August 1943, even the most optimistic German naval officers acknowledged that the Bay of Biscay had become a killing ground. Admiral Dönitz, who had built his reputation on U-boat warfare, was forced to confront an impossible equation. His submarines couldn't reach the Atlantic without crossing the bay, but crossing the bay meant running a gauntlet where survival was increasingly unlikely. Captain Zur C. Eberhard Gott, Dönitz's chief of staff, summarized the situation in an August 15 memorandum. British Beaufighter aircraft armed with automatic 57mm cannon have made daylight surface transit of the Bay of Biscay prohibitively dangerous. Our losses in the bay now exceed our losses in actual combat operations. The aircraft attack below visual acquisition distance, fire weapons that penetrate our pressure hull before we can dive, and operate in coordinated groups that make evasion impossible. Surface fighting has proven suicidal. We have no effective countermeasure. The solution, ordering U-boats to transit the bay submerged, was technically possible but operationally crippling. Submerged transit at 4 knots took 4 days compared to 18 hours on the surface at 17 knots. The extended submerged time exhausted batteries, depleted air quality to dangerous levels, and left submarines arriving in the Atlantic with reduced operational capability. More significantly, the psychological damage was irreparable. U-boat crews who once sailed with confidence now departed on patrol with fatalistic resignation. The survival rate for U-boat crews, already appalling at 75% casualty rate overall, became even worse for boats that encountered Beaufighters. Oberleutnant Heinrich Brada, commanding U-373, wrote in a letter to his wife, "Intercepted by British intelligence, we know we're dead men sailing. The crossing is Russian roulette with 5 chambers loaded. If a Beaufighter finds us, we die. It's that simple. The shells tear through our hull like paper. I've seen gun camera film from British attacks. Submarines simply disintegrate under fire. There's no defense, no escape. We sail because we must, but we sail without hope." Brada's U-373 was destroyed on August 8, 1943 by Flying Officer Marcus Whitfield of 404 Squadron RCAF. The attack followed the now standard pattern: radar detection, low-level approach, opening fire at the 18-second point. U-373's pressure hull was breached in 4 locations. The submarine went down with all hands. In December 1944, with Germany's defeat inevitable, Gross Admiral Dönitz was interviewed by Captain Zur C. Ludwig Stummel, compiling an internal assessment of the U-boat campaign's failure. The transcript, captured after the war, revealed Dönitz's bitter recognition of how completely the Beaufighter had disrupted his strategy. The Beaufighter with the 57mm cannon was the weapon that broke the U-boat offensive, Dönitz admitted. We had solutions for depth charges, dive deep. We had solutions for conventional aircraft attack, crash dive before they arrived. We had no solution for an aircraft that could find us by radar, approach invisibly at wave height, and destroy us on the surface in seconds. The fundamental equation of submarine warfare changed. We could no longer dive fast enough to evade. Our primary defense became useless. Dönitz continued, what made it worse was their systematic approach. They didn't just stumble onto the tactic, they developed it scientifically, refined it through practice, and applied it with industrial efficiency. They trained pilots specifically for this mission. They produced enough aircraft to maintain constant patrols. They coordinated their attacks to overwhelm our defenses. It was typical British engineering: identify the problem, develop the solution, manufacture it in quantity, apply it ruthlessly. The statistics supported Dönitz's assessment. Between January 1943 and May 1945, Beaufighter strikes destroyed or severely damaged 53 U-boats, an average of more than one per month. The actual impact was far greater than the direct kills. Hundreds of U-boat patrols were cut short, forced to abort, or reduced in effectiveness because submarines spent their time dodging aircraft rather than hunting convoys. At the Imperial War Museum in London, a restored Beaufighter equipped with the Mollins installation sits in the Naval Aviation Hall. The placard describes its technical specifications and combat record, but the most compelling artifact is displayed in a case beside the aircraft, a section of Type WWII pressure hull, 26mm steel plate, with a 57mm hole punched cleanly through it. The hole is surrounded by petalled steel fragments bent inward by the shell's impact. The metal around the penetration shows stress fractures radiating outward, evidence of the catastrophic structural failure that occurred when high-velocity projectiles struck pressure holes designed only to withstand external water pressure. Below the pressure hull section is a placard with a quote from a captured U-boat commander, Captain Lieutenant Ernst Cordes, taken from his May 1943 interrogation. We heard stories about the Beaufighters, but I didn't believe them until I saw one attack. The aircraft appeared from nowhere, we never spotted it until shells were already striking us. The sound was like Thor's hammer striking an anvil. Our pressure hull, designed to withstand depth charges and ocean pressure, was pierced like tin foil. We had 18 seconds from the moment our lookout screamed the warning until the first shells hit. 18 seconds to dive, close hatches, and pray. It was never enough time. My boat survived only because the pilot's aim was slightly off and the shells missed the pressure hull by centimeters. I was the lucky one. Most commanders who faced those guns are on the bottom of the Atlantic. The German Naval High Command's post-war analysis, compiled in 1946, concluded with brutal honesty: the Beaufighter strike aircraft represented a revolution in anti-submarine warfare. By combining radar detection, low-altitude approach, and concentrated firepower capable of penetrating submarine hulls before diving was complete, the British created a weapon system against which we had no effective defense. Our submarines could evade destroyers, escape from convoys, and survive depth charge attacks. But they could not survive the Mollins gun. The 18-second window between detection and destruction was too narrow for successful evasion. The U-boat service's casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any German military branch, was significantly contributed to by these aircraft. They didn't just sink submarines. They made submarine warfare obsolete. In the end, the German captains who had initially dismissed the Beaufighter as just another aircraft learned a lesson written in steel and blood. Technological innovation combined with tactical excellence creates paradigm shifts that render previous advantages meaningless. The U-boat had dominated the Atlantic for 3 years through its ability to dive and evade. The Beaufighter strike, with its 57mm cannon and 18-second kill window, made that ability irrelevant. The thunder of 8 Browning machine guns had dominated European skies, but it was the distinctive boom of the Mollins cannon that echoed across the Atlantic depths, a sound that meant death was already 18 seconds too close.